Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm Hilary.Salt.
And I'm Sebastian.Moore.
And this is our news section of our split up sections that we're doing now. And we have two items from the news to talk about. Sebastian, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so we were very keen today not to talk about Ukraine, Trump and the world sort of global agenda because it's getting a lot of coverage.
It is.
And whilst it really is important, also a big part of this podcast is talking about local things and things that affect us here and now. And so I wanted to talk about an event I went to on Tuesday, which was the AGM for the Castlefield Forum.
The annual general meeting. AGM,
Oh, everybody knows what an AGM
yeah.
is. Even I know what an AGM is.
Sometimes people don't just, they hear these three-letter acronyms and they think, what does that mean? So we'll say what it is.
Exactly, yeah. So the Castlefield Forum. So for anybody that doesn't know Manchester, Castlefield is the historic centre of Manchester, which is now it sort of forms part of the city centre, but it's essentially where the Roman settlement was 2,000 years ago, when Manchester was known as
Mancunia? No.
Mamucium.
Oh, right, okay.
Mamucium, and supposedly, and this might be a folk etymology, but supposedly it was known as Mamucium. Mam comes from like where we get the word mammary gland and so on. It's like a breast.
Yes.
Because the hill where the fort was located looked like a breast-shaped hill.
Right, okay,
So
there
that's
you
why
go.
we get Manchester. Eventually, in the Middle Ages, it turned from mam to man.
Okay.
That's where we get Manchester. And so I live in Castlefield, and we were talking just before this about kind of what is Castlefield, because it's not a town, it's not a city, that's because it's in Manchester, and it's not even like a local authority or a governmental area. It's just a historic area which people refer to. So really it forms, half of it is in the Deansgate ward, and people that know Manchester will know Deansgate, one of the most famous streets in the city, and half of it is in the Hume ward, which is just the other side of the Manchester Ring Road.
And perhaps rather less salubrious than the Deansgate ward.
Yes, and there is, I think this happens a lot in Manchester and anywhere really, but there a lot of the time is people that live in Hume will say they live in Castlefield.
Yes.
And it happened in Moss Side, where they were chopping extra bits off places like Rusholme and Whalley Range around to say, no, that's not Moss Side, because they thought it would be better for house prices and so on. Anyway, so Castlefield Forum is a community group that is a charity, all volunteers, and they basically look after the heritage of the Castlefield area, and they're involved in a few different projects. And I went along partly because I've lived in Castlefield for 3 years and have had no connection to the local area at all. I think it's one of the problems of nowadays that you can live in a big city, and really I've got friends all over the city, in the south and the north, and constantly travelling around, and I don't feel much connection to that small local area. So I thought it'd be nice to go along and just know what's happening.
You do find like city centre neighbourhoods especially can be quite transient as well, don't you? People come and go.
Exactly, and I found it really weird because the city centre it doesn't necessarily belong to the people that live in the city centre. It kind of belongs to everybody, because it belongs to the people that are travelling in for work or the tourists that are coming. And so it's kind of a weird feeling I went to this meeting, which was in the Museum of Science and Industry.
Lovely.
So Castlefield itself, whilst a really small area, we have so much there. So the Museum of Science and Industry, you've got the Roman gardens, and where the reconstructed Roman fort is. You've got the canals where they filmed Peaky Blinders, of course. And I live just behind the canal. And I sat there in this room full of all these people that live in Castlefield. And I just thought, okay, so this is the local community, or this is a slither of the local community. Now, the format of the meeting, we listened to a couple of local councillors, we listened to some talks from the people from the museum, the plans they have to reopen certain entrances. So for anybody that knows the local area, the museum has entrances on Liverpool Street and Water Street that have been closed for a long time, and they've had work going on, and they're hoping to reopen those, as well as there's an amazing viaduct where you'll know this from when you travel in on the tram from where you live. You'll see that it's just a sort of disused area, and they've taken part of it and turned it into a community garden.
Yep.
And that was the National Trust that got involved and did that. And they were updating us on the plans for this area. And so it was really interesting to actually have an insight into what's going on where I live. Now, I think a lot of other people will have a parish council. So, sorry, it's okay. So, the majority of the country, in terms of land mass, is served by a parish council, because parish councils are typical for rural areas. However, the majority of the population, because the majority of people live in towns and cities, do not have a parish council. So, for us in Manchester, there's none at all really in Greater Manchester. And so I think I see this Castlefield Forum almost acting in place of the parish council in some ways, because they're planting trees and they're looking after the gardens. They've installed some lights by the Roman fort to light it up at night. So they're doing a lot of things that the parish council would have done.
So hyper-local, you might say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So parish councils generally will look after the things that the local authority kind of want to kind of shift to them, bus stops and flower beds and all of that stuff. Now, the problem with doing it like this, or with having a community group, is most people don't know of them. I only know of this group because when me and when my housemate and I moved into where we live now 3 years ago, we knocked on all of the doors in our building, and you got some very shocked faces saying, "What are you doing here? What's this for?" I just wanted to introduce ourselves and say hello. And one of the people we spoke to actually is on the board of trustees for the Castlefield Forum. So it was a really organic way of finding out about them. But my fear is that these things are few and far between, and most people don't know what's going on. And so it doesn't enable the people that live locally to actually get involved in these groups.
And there's not a notice board. I know that sounds very old-fashioned, but certainly in my park, the way we communicate with the community is through the notice board.
I've not seen a notice board, no. Okay.
Maybe you put that on the agenda for the next meeting.
Where would a notice board go? I don't know.
You'd have to put it up in a way, in somewhere where you could, put it like a glass cover on it, so that, obviously with the Manchester weather, your notices survive. But I think it's worth thinking about.
So there were a couple of interesting things that happened at the meeting that I thought would be interesting to talk to you about. One of the talks was given by the site manager of this development where they're renovating a mill and turning it into apartments. And he was interrogated a little bit afterwards about, how much of this will be social housing, how much of it will be affordable, etc. And he said to everybody, all of this will be for rent. So one of the problems with that is that you get 190 new apartments and 190 families or individuals coming and moving in and living transiently in a similar way to how I feel. I don't feel a strong connection to the area. And I think we see that in Manchester. A lot of these buildings going up for people that come from outside, students that are renting the accommodation, and it adds to this transient feel within the neighbourhoods. And
they're often sold as kind of buy-to-let properties, aren't they?
Exactly, yeah. So I thought that was interesting. The second takeaway was that one of the biggest contentious issues was graffiti. So everybody was very upset about the graffiti. And I was struck by this feeling that we are living in parallel worlds, because they're talking about these people that are graffitiing on the bridges and stuff. And I've seen it a lot where you get groups of young boys, usually teenagers, cycling around on their bikes, sort of intimidating people, and they'll often wear like balaclavas and stuff. Yeah. It's really weird, and it's especially weird seeing in a place like Castlefield. So you get this contrast between because it's a fairly wealthy neighbourhood. I'm not wealthy, but the people that live there are.
You aspire to be, Sebastian.
I suppose so. And you get this contrast between the people that are at this meeting that know about these things, that have the time and the ability to kind of sit on boards of trustees talking about the issues like graffiti, and it just feels very out of touch, like they don't understand necessarily why that's happening. And I don't really have an answer for this, but I was just struck when I was walking back home afterwards about the disconnect from the various players, the various people that are involved.
Yeah, and we've talked before, haven't we, about this idea that we should have a kind of zero tolerance approach to things like graffiti. And we talked about the broken windows thesis? Didn't Wayne Dixon talk to us about that?
Yeah.
Where if you let one window be broken, they're all broken. And I do think there's some rationale for talking about graffiti on the basis that if you tackle those small things, the bigger things, start to fall into place a bit more.
Yeah.
I was on the tram yesterday and did my usual shouting at a young girl for putting her feet on the seats, and she was with a whole group of friends, and so they all put their feet on the seats to show me that I wasn't allowed to tell them off. So I told them all off, and I do think sometimes you've just got to do that.
I just have this image of you going around Manchester just saying, "Get your feet off the seats, sit up straight."
I do. I don't say sit up straight, to be fair, because I probably don't sit up straight either. But yeah.
So the council were represented by a councillor from Deansgate Ward and a councillor from the Hume Ward, and they were explaining why the graffiti is an issue and how they've struggled to deal with it, and why it's problematic is because they have to go through different processes of when they see graffiti and when it's reported. Yeah. Often it's on a building, they have to go and, especially if it's on a listed building, there's a huge problem with that. And someone made the point, they said, do you know what we should do is, because we get a lot of people filming in Castlefield because it's a picturesque area, and like Peaky Blinders and other productions. And he said, when they come, they clean it up because they want it to look nice for the film, for the series. He said, we just need more people making films in Castlefield, because whenever they come, it's immediately the graffiti's gone. So it shows that it is possible. It's the will. Often it's the will.
I do wonder whether a production company really thinks about the requirements on a listed building before it removes the graffiti, though.
Probably not. So my final point then is a bit of a suggestion, and it's a little bit out there, but certainly for the purposes of this group, they've defined the boundaries of Castlefield. And they were sort of talking about certain places, and I'd never really thought, that place is part of Castlefield, and it's really like hyper-local geography. So that and I'm a bit of a geography nerd, as you know. So they're mentioning streets and whether the one corner of one street intersects with another. I'm like, oh yeah, I know that. Wow, that's great. And whilst I was walking home, I was really aware of where I was and where exactly I was within Castlefield. Because what's strange is when you're talking about an area and then you sort of leave the room you're in and you realise, oh, I'm in the area, aren't I? And I was sort of looking at the community, the place in a completely different way. And I thought, what we need to define where places are. And I think one of the problems is that we used to have a system where we'd have villages and towns and we would know where we were. We're in this village and we're in this little community. But as populations have grown and towns have sort of merged and the urban sprawl has taken place, we've lost that sense of this is exactly where I am. I'm in this area. And so what I would like to see is something that delineates one area from another. And it doesn't have to be big. It could just be a different colour of lamppost. Something really small that just says, you're in Castlefield right now. So when you do something like you're graffitiing or something, you are affecting the people that live here and you're affecting this place. And I think that will help to create a greater sense of place, a greater sense of where we live and the people that we need to be communicating with if we want to help improve our local area.
You'll probably know better than I on this, but aren't there some Spanish towns where the different areas, you have a street sign and then underneath it says this area? Is it maybe it's France or somewhere else? I'm sure there's a European place I've been to where it does kind of delineate places like that. So it's been done, I think.
I'm having to
So
rack
good.
my head now, but I do know that, and this is where my memory will fail me, but I know that when being in other countries, I've noticed things they do like that,
Yeah.
where they make it easier to kind of see where you are. One thing I noticed I don't know if we have this in Manchester, but when I was living in Sheffield, is that on road signs they have the postcode. You ever seen that?
No,
Just the
never.
first bit, so it'd be S7 on the end of the road, like Talbot Road, S7.
I've never seen that.
Yeah.
Where I live in Sale, it's a particular problem because obviously if you search anything with the word Sale, S-A-L-E, it just brings up a load of,
Shopping results.
shopping results. Yeah, exactly. So we call Sale a lot of the time M33 because that's how you search for Sale without using the word Sale. But no, I've not seen it on road signs, no.
So a greater distinction and
Yeah.
categorization of where we live,
Yeah,
rather than using postcodes.
Okay.
We never know which metric to follow, so we need one metric where we go, this
Yes.
is the place you are currently in.
yeah, great. That sounds good. Can I just postscript one tiny point? Because I was speaking to a couple of our members last night. We had a little get-together last night. And we were talking about some of the things we might do with members because, we often get together and have a bite to eat or a coffee and things like that. And what else could we do? And I was saying we could get together and do a litter pick and one of our members, Wendy, who, said, the thing about litter picks is that it feels to me that young men throw litter down on the floor and old women pick it up. And she's a bit annoyed about that being the way that the world works. So she was thinking, what else could we do other than litter picks? So we were having a bit of a brainstorm last night about doing things like cleaning bins. And that's one of the things we do down the park. That's something I've done before. Or cleaning street signs. But I'd be really interested to know if other people have ideas about what can you do in your community that kind of shows your commitment to that community and shows that you do care, that is not litter picking. So any ideas, people, do get in touch.
Brilliant. Okay, let's move on to the slightly more, I said to you beforehand, your section is going to have slightly more intellectual depth to it.
Well, it's not so much intellectual. It's perhaps, it's certainly political, and it is a bit of detail in terms of legislative change.
But this is why we need you, Hilary. When there's something in the news like this, the Employment Rights Bill, and we don't really understand it, so we need you to explain it to us.
Okay, well, shall I have a go?
Yes, please.
So this is the government's once-in-a-generation improvement to workers' rights legislation, most ably championed by Angela Rayner, Deputy Prime Minister. And, the Labour Party argue that this is a bedrock on which we can build a sustainable growth agenda. So they are, touting this as part of their growth agenda. What's in it? And there's a massive number of little things in it. So, on the basis that we don't want to be here next Wednesday, I will, just pick out some of the highlights, really. So things like an end to 0 hours contracts. So people will have the right to have their regular hours reflected in their contract. They'll have the right to have some partial payment if their hours are cancelled at the last minute. So, giving people more security in those kind of jobs. An extension on sick pay. So at the moment, people who earn below the lower earnings limit don't get sick pay. They will get sick pay. An extension of some of the employment rights that people have so that they apply from their first day of employment. Often some of those employment rights don't kick in until you've been employed for a certain period of time. Some extension of maternity rights, in particular on things like your right not to be made redundant whilst you're on maternity leave. And more rights to flexible working. So at the moment, everybody has, after a certain period of time with an employer, a right to request flexible working. And the employer has to consider, to take reasonable steps to see if they can consider that request.
And by flexible working, do you mean hybrid working?
Not necessarily. It could mean, for example, working school hours only, or term time only, or working 3 days a week rather than 4 days a week. Just working more flexibly than 9 to 5, 5 days a week. And that will be almost the default position. Everybody will be entitled to work flexibly from day one, and the employer has to say yes unless they have a good reason to say no. And the good reasons to say no are things like it makes it impossible for them to provide the service level that they need to provide in their business, or it imposes undue costs, so those kind of things. So a lot of those things sound, not unreasonable things for workers to want. I'm a great believer that, workers should be able to have dignity and respect in their workplace, and I don't object in principle to those kind of things being available to workers. And to be honest, for a lot of workers with good employers, they have all those things anyway, not because the law says, but because the employer wants them to, have a good experience at work and to stay in that workplace and to do their best work there. At the same time, there are some very bad employers who don't provide any of that, and there's always a bit of a question mark as to whether illegal changes will make those employers change. One of the difficulties in the UK is that we have a lot of employment legislation, but we have almost no enforcement of that legislation. So in other words, it's workers who have to enforce those rights in the workplace by doing things like taking employment tribunal cases, which is a very clunky way to enforce your rights. So all these new rights, employers' organisations are arguing quite strongly that a lot of these are very problematic. So if we take the 0 hours contracts one, if you look at industries like retail or hospitality, they would argue quite strongly that there are times when things are very busy, there are times when things are not busy, and we need flexibility to be able to call people in if we are busy, perhaps unexpectedly, or we don't need people in that day when we perhaps thought we would do. So the 0 hours contract work will, I think, without a doubt, increase costs for those kind of employers. And I think the problem with a lot of this legislation is that if you put it into legislation, you have to write the regulations, and they have to be very unambiguous. And you can't be very unambiguous, can you? They have to be unambiguous and clear, and following a very clear detail of this is what's required, when is it required, by whom is it required, and you have to write all that down in black and white. Now, that kind of detailed work might work really well for company A, but it might work very badly for company B because the place, the kind of work that they do, the workforce they have might be very different. And I think there's always a problem with improving workers' rights by changing the legislation in a way where the government gives you that right. And there's two problems with it. One is it's very inflexible. And the other is that it kind of takes away agency from workers. So I always say in the olden days, and it's not very clear what I mean by that, but in the 60s and 70s, if there was a real problem in a workplace, the trade union would take steps to either negotiate with management or in some cases to take industrial action to force management to negotiate, to introduce better rules for that individual workplace. And that has two advantages to it. One, it can say, we'll come up with rules that are very flexible and that work for us. And the other is it gives workers agency in being able to say, we changed that. We made that better for us and our fellow employees. And also, it kind of gives them a stake in that workplace as well, because they know that unlike, John Smith and Son down the road, they've won all these rights in their workplace, and that's why they have more of a commitment and a reason to work well in that workplace. So my view is that a lot of these very detailed and nitty gritty regulations that are being brought in will actually be quite problematic for businesses, and especially small businesses, where you don't have an army of HR people saying this is exactly how we'll enact this new requirement in our workplace. You generally have a business owner or a couple of partners trying to work out how we're going to work this, because it doesn't really work for us. And often in those situations, what happens is they then turn to some external consultant to help them put those regulations in force. When that happens, external consultants are very much trying to make sure that they don't give any advice or do anything that's less than the legal requirements. So they tend to kind of gold plate what's required. So you have the legislation, which is very detailed and restrictive. You often then get that enacted in a way that's even more restricted and detailed. And, that is, I think, really a barrier for business. And I would much rather see the government of the day, and this is a government that's meant to be pro-worker, and yet is not rescinding any of the anti-trade union legislation that Thatcher brought in. So we still have all those requirements. For example, if you conduct a strike ballot, you have to do it by post. Can't do it online. You have to have elections for general secretaries in trade unions at required timescales. So a lot of that really problematic legislation for trade unions that takes away workers' agency in the workplace, that's not being rescinded by this government. And I would much rather see them doing something about that rather than introducing all these layers and layers and layers of regulation that actually make it very difficult to run a business.
The biggest scepticism I have with the Employment Rights Bill, from what you're talking about, and I think you sort of made this point, is that it takes away agency. And, you're talking about the ending 0 hours contract. My concern is when you have a top-down approach from this, you miss the scenarios where people might want a 0 hours contract, if it's beneficial to them and it's beneficial to their employer. And I really dislike the idea of government getting in the way and stopping something from happening when both parties are happy with it.
Exactly that, yes. So you're right that for a lot of people, and I think there was, I can't remember his name now, but the head of Currys was writing in the Times this weekend, and he said, here's an example of one of my employees. He started on a 0 hours contract when he was in university. He came and did, and I kind of imagine he was working on the tech desk, explaining to people what kind of computer they might buy. So he came in on a 0 hours contract. He worked throughout the time that he was at university, working very flexibly. Some weeks he didn't work at all because he had exams to do, or he had, other interests that people form in universities. Other weeks he did quite a lot of work. And then when he left university, he actually carried on working for them, and he's now a manager in the store. And, those are the kind of career paths that can often start with a 0 hours contract that, as you say, works really well for the employee and the employer.
Or an apprenticeship.
Well, yeah, again,
on a different thing, but
exactly. I mean, I'm a great believer and a great supporter of apprenticeships, and that kind of that contract between an employer, stepping up to the plate and offering the training, and an employee who really wants to, further their career, I think can be a really creative relationship.
And it's something that would have happened in the past where people started off, they came out of school, they started off with a company and they worked their way up. And I know it's something that my generation sort of looks back on with rose-tinted glasses, because we think, oh, I'd love that, where I could really work my way up through a company. I think that's something we've really lost nowadays, is this idea of career progression within one company. And it's the root of a lot of our problems, certainly when you look at things like nuclear energy and engineering, manufacturing, is the fact that you have professional managers that get moved from one company to another, and there's not the sense that the person that's in that position has worked their way up from the bottom, and we're stopping people from being able to do that, I think, and that's something we have to get back to.
I agree. Yeah. I was in the loft at my dad's house the other weekend, and I found his apprenticeship papers. So my dad did an apprenticeship with a local company in Bolton called Seddon's, a kind of family-owned business. And it was really interesting to see that his apprenticeship had been signed off by one of the Seddons, so one of the owners of the business. And as you say, it'd be great to bring some of those back. We've kind of drifted away from the Employment Rights Act, but that would be good. So hope you enjoyed our news section this week. If you have any ideas for things we can do in our communities, do drop us an email. We'll put our email addresses in the show notes. And if you disagreed with us or you have views on any of the things we've talked about, do get in touch as well. Please do like, subscribe and share the podcast with your friends. Some breaking news is that we aren't going to record an episode of the podcast next week, but we already have in the kind of real special, don't we? An interview with William Clouston, the leader of the Social Democratic Party. So look out for that in your podcast application next week.
Did you say, so look out for that? Just do that line again, so look out for that.
Yeah, sorry. So look out for that next week on...
Wherever you get your podcast.
So look out for that next week, wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks for listening.
Bye now.